So Jesse's been hassling me for about 2 years to get up and do this, so I'm finally doing it. So what I'm going to talk about, domestic commercial vessel survey here in Australia, and the changes that have happened probably in my time working as a surveyor over the past 20 years, because there's been significant changes with AMSA coming on board, and I'm just going to go through some of those changes with you tonight. Just a bit of background. I did naval architecture at the Maritime College down in Tassie, and started as a surveyor as a graduate over in Western Australia after that, and have worked as a surveyor, not just at DC for surveyor, but also in oil and gas for probably the last 18 years. So in that time, we've seen significant changes from the original time when we were working with the USL code all the way through to now. So today I wanted to sort of go through and talk about some of those changes, talk about the standards that have changed, the different law and regulations around commercial vessels, how the regulators have changed in that time, and also survey. The company I work for now, Maritime Survey Australia, been going about 2 years, Mick. Yeah, so that was on the back of there's 4 of us in the company that used to work for the state regulator here in Victoria. AMSA privatised all that system recently, so Mick went out and started a company, and then pulled another 3 of us in to come and work with him. So we do mainly domestic commercial vessel work here in Victoria, and we're spreading our wings to Sydney. A lot of work in Sydney now and Tasmania. We're also the 3 naval architects in the company, so we're doing a lot of consultancy work as well, and seeing that grow a lot more now, because some of the surveys are starting to drop off, because I'll touch on it later, there's a risk-based survey regime here in Australia now, so we don't have surveys every year of commercial vessels anymore. And being a arena event, I thought I'd touch on naval architecture and the crossover between naval architecture and marine survey, the role that naval architects can play in the marine survey area, and what type of work we do. So I thought I'd just give a bit of context to start with around what is actually a domestic commercial vessel, because a lot of you are probably used to class societies and larger type vessels. There's a National Law Act now that defines what a commercial vessel is in Australia, a domestic one. It's basically a vessel that operates in a commercial, government or research activity, but primarily it's vessels that operate within the EEZ. So if they're operating overseas or anything like that, they wouldn't be a domestic commercial vessel. So we're primarily looking at tiny little boats up to 35-metre boats operating commercially in Australia. I guess the key ones that aren't included in that, you guys in the room, are defence vessels. Don't need to be domestic commercial vessels if they're operated by defence. Contractors to defence are finding that they actually should be domestic commercial vessels. And then you've got regulated Australian vessels, foreign vessels, which I touched on, and then vessels that are operated by schools or community groups. They're sort of exempt from being a commercial vessel. So I'll go back to the start, basically when I started as a surveyor in the early 2000s. Domestic commercial vessel surveys in Australia were managed by individual states and territories. So every state and territory in Australia, the government there had a marine safety office. They employed their government marine surveyors, and all their admin and everything was done for that particular state. One of the issues with that was each state and territory issued their own certificates of surveys to vessels. So the certificate they issued to that vessel, if it was in Western Australia, was for Western Australia. If that vessel wanted to come to Victoria, for instance, they couldn't with that certificate. They'd have to either go and apply for a permit to operate in Victoria, or they'd have to come to Victoria and apply for a certificate of survey, which involved a bit of red tape, because the surveyor had to go down to the boat and verify compliance, because the states didn't recognise each other quite a lot of the time. So that was a bit of a handbrake here in Australia. And at the time we applied the Uniform Shipping Laws Code. That was a fairly prescriptive standard. It was pretty black and white, easy to apply, but there was not a lot of flexibility in it. So particularly smaller type work boats just found it difficult to comply with the code a lot of the time. So what the individual states and territories actually did with that, they issued local exemptions, instructions to the surveyors to apply to their local operations and local operating areas for those types of vessels. And that was fine for them when they were operating in those areas, but if they ever wanted to take that vessel to another state or territory, it was basically start survey again, because the adoption of anything in that state was not recognised in the other state of Australia. So the next step, I guess, along from that, there was obviously recognition here in Australia that there needed to be new standards for commercial vessels to provide more flexibility around how they could comply, and to adopt a standard, a national type standard. So there was, I think the government formed, it was an intergovernmental committee was formed, the National Marine Safety Committee. It looked at wreck boats, builders' plates, I understand, but also the national standards for commercial vessels. So I think I wasn't right across this at the time, but I think they engaged with the states and the territories and operators in forming new standards around everything from construction through fire systems, machinery, comms, nets, everything. It started to adopt, I think 2008 they started to implement some of these standards, but they were staggered as they were ratified, and some of the states and territories are actually adopting them at different stages because they're still working under their own state legislation at that stage. So they could choose to opt in or opt out of those standards. Today we've got a full set of the NSCV except the watertight integrity standard. It still hasn't been implemented by AMSA, so we're still working on part of the USL code on some of it, on that, and then other standards through the NSCV. The NSCV is more a performance type standard, so I'll touch on this a bit more later, but the way the NSCV is set up is, say we're looking at construction, it's got required outcomes of construction. So it might say, okay, a vessel needs to be constructed to withstand the dynamic loads of operating offshore. And then it'll have in the standard what's called an equivalent solution to meet that standard. So in the construction section of the NSCV, it might be Lloyd Special Service Craft is the deemed to satisfy solution to meet that required outcome. But then operators or designers, naval architects can propose different solutions to meet those required outcomes. So they might say, okay, we want to use BB rules to design this vessel. They can then apply and get an equivalent solution, which I'll touch on later with Answer on how that process is now working. Moving into 2012, AMSA then issued a new Marine Safety Act, a National Safety Act, to replace all the state and territory legislation around Australia. Obviously the idea of that was primarily to be able to actually issue national certificates to allow vessels to operate all around Australia instead of being isolated to their own states. An important thing that was introduced with the national law was also safety duties, which are applied to naval architects, designers, boat builders, operators, owners of vessels. These introduce requirements around the quality and the safety of what they're actually delivering, so they've got responsibilities under the national law now. I'll touch on that later, but AMSA actually regulate that and provide oversight of compliance of that standards. And as I said, national certificates are implemented. The issue with existing vessels that were in individual states where they had local adoptions of standards, those vessels were grandfathered under these new certificates. So if they had something that only allowed them to operate in their state, they could still only operate in their state. They had to obviously apply to modify the vessel or upgrade it to comply to then move around Australia still. So we've still got plenty of grandfathered vessels in Australia that are stuck in Queensland, stuck in Tasmania, and they'll probably never leave that state of the territory. So up to where we are now, as of July this year, AMSA became the single national regulator here in Australia. So all the state and territory marine agencies that were doing commercial vessels or closed shop. Those agencies are still there. They're doing rec boating, waterway management within those states. Some of the states, I believe, are sort of cooperating with AMPS and doing some work with them. In Sydney, I believe they are. I know here in Victoria, the commercial vessel division within there's now closed down. So AMSA, they're centralised in Cairns, but they're starting to set. Well, they've always had offices around Australia for the shipping side of things, but they're announcing more and more offices to manage the national system because there's how many vessels are there in Australia? 27,000. So there's a lot of vessels for them to regulate. And I think they're just starting to realise that because they're announcing offices in Coffs Harbour and that sort of thing. They've also employed a lot of ex-government surveyors and a lot of naval architects over the past few years. And they're spotted around Australia. And what they've introduced with the new national system is the accreditation of AMSA accredited surveyors, which are private surveyors like ourselves that are accredited by AMSA to actually go and do the work instead of the government surveyors. So a lot of those government surveyors that were in the state and territory agencies were transferred directly over to AMSA, and their existing accreditation with that state qualifications were accepted, like ourselves. If you're a new surveyor coming to the system now, you've actually got to apply through AMSA. You've got to sit an interview process with them for the particular categories. I'll go into the categories in a minute you're applying to. And then they'll either approve you or not approve you to go out and do it. They'll also, if you haven't got the practical experience, then you've got to go out with other surveyors to gain that experience. It's a real key problem for us at the moment as a small company, because when it was a national system, as a graduate out of uni, you could go to a state government and be mentored for 5 years, and the government pays for all your training and get a great lot of experience, because coming out as a naval architect, you've got a lot of technical knowledge, but you don't have that practical knowledge. So for a small company like us to employ a graduate and give them that 5 years of experience at the moment is very hard, and a real key issue for us trying to grow our business. There are diplomas that are being set up. The International Institute of Marine Surveyors and the Australasian Institute of Marine Surveyors, they've got diplomas in place, but the diplomas are only one thing that's gaining that experience, and I think that's going to be a problem potentially going forward for AMSA. One thing we find with AMSA also, there's still a heavy oversight of what we actually do as accredited surveyors. So if we're doing an initial survey on a vessel, we get to the end of the build and we submit everything to AMSA. We recommend go and issue a certificate of survey. They'll actually allocate one of their internal naval architects or marine surveyors to actually audit everything that we're submitting, because it's apparently their responsibility under law when they're issuing the certificate to assure themselves that the boat's compliant. Same with the periodic survey. When a periodic survey is recommended to AMSA, someone will actually review that before they allow the vessel to go through. And it'd be quite tricky. As an initial surveyor, you could have been working on a build for 18 months, do a submission to AMSA. The boat owners usually applies to a permit in advance to actually operate, because you're delivering a boat to someone you want it operating. If you haven't dotted all the crosses and T's doing that, it's a potential issue, because AMSA can come back to you and ask for further information. It's a bit embarrassing. You've got to go back to the boat builder, the designer, and say, sorry, we need this. So you've really got to make sure you understand your marine orders, your standards, and your regulations and rules around what you're doing as an accredited surveyor, more so than when you're in the government, where you had a lot more freedom about the decisions as a government agency you could make. And you also were able to sit in an office and talk to the people making those decisions. Now we're either on the phone and trying to get contact with a surveyor or naval architect, or we're sending emails and waiting for advice on that. So that can be quite tricky. Moving on, so AMSA have also identified now we've got a national system that the NSCB can't still apply to everyone. So we are finding there are being exemptions issued as a national regulator for local operations, local qualifications, and also what's called equivalent solutions, as I touched on before with the standards. As accredited surveyors, we're not allowed to actually approve an equivalent solution. We find designers and operators come to us a lot to help them with the applications because they don't understand the process. So we've got to work with them, then we've got to submit an application to AMSA and then wait for AMSA to come back and say, yes, you're approved or you're not approved. A good example is that one I'm working on today was a vessel that wanted to increase its distance offshore. It had a stability book from 10 years ago. Now it was done to the IMO high-speed craft code, which is fine. But as a surveyor, I can't approve to that because it's not a deemed satisfied solution in the standards. So I have to actually help them apply to AMSA for an equivalent solution to accept the use of that criteria in lieu of using the NSEV stability criteria. So I'll just go into the accreditation categories in a bit more detail. This gives you a bit of a summary. It's broken down a lot more than that. But on initial survey, there's plan approval. So when you apply for an accreditation, you'll apply for categories where you've got the education and technical knowledge of that category and also the experience. So typically a lot of naval architects will be categorised in the plan approval initial survey. So the plan approval as a DCV involves you reviewing plans in accordance with the standard. It's not just construction, it's engineering systems, electrical systems if you're accredited to do so, fire systems, nav system, comm system, everything that goes into basically the construction and fit out of the vessel. So you'll review plans, you'll work with the naval architect or boat builder where they're non-compliant to get compliant plans, and then obviously the end product is stamp plans and a letter of approval to be issued to AMSA. Initial survey stability approvals are a separate accreditation, so you'll see again a lot of naval architects. A lot of naval architect consultants that have always been working in Australia are now actually becoming accredited in stability and plan approval. Because under the national law, a naval architect who draws up their own plans or writes up their own stability book can actually sign off their stability book and plans under the national law. So they're finding that's obviously streamlined. They can go to an owner or an operator and say, we can provide you, this is a one-stop shop instead of having to go like they used to the state authorities. I must say that's not something we do. We wouldn't, as a company ourselves, we don't like the oversight of one person drawing plans and approving plans or writing up a stability book and approving your own stability book without any oversight. So we always make sure that there's separation there and a second set of eyes. Load line is under initial survey as well. We don't see a lot of load line vessels specific. Well, down here in Melbourne, there's a lot more in Sydney, so I think it's over 24 metres. They require load line, so that's a separate category. Electrical is an interesting one. When you're within the state government, you could obviously approve DC battery installations, but the 240 volt was always put out to a licensed electrician to actually sign that off on vessels. I know myself, when I went out of the government to BMT, AMSA took my 240 volt off me, and a lot of people, some still have it, but they've recognised there's not a lot of accredited surveyors in Australia with 240 volt, so they're allowing licensed electricians now to actually sign off 240 volt installations on vessels. They've got to be accredited to do the plan approval, but they can come in and do that during construction. And also, obviously, when they've got to have tests every 4 years on existing vessels. There's a separate category for construction and alteration. So construction is the inspections during the builds. So as naval architects, we've got a lot of experience in understanding the construction of vessels. The design of vessels. Once you've got that practical experience around construction, you see a lot of naval architects categorised in that area. And obviously all the alterations to do with modifications to vessels or if something damages or structural damages occurred to vessels and they need to rectify it. And then periodic survey, there are different categories to those as well. Periodic survey is, or used to be, your annual survey inspection of a vessel to verify the the vessel's compliance. That's gone to risk-based regime, which we'll touch on in a minute. So that's in water surveys, out of water surveys for compliance. And then it's electrical load line, safety equipment and communications equipment. There's different surveys that are just categorised in individual areas or the full lot of categories. But what you'll find is a company like us, we need to have people accredited across every category so that if someone comes to you, you can provide them a full service instead of them having to go here and there to take compliance. So this is not going to come up too well on this screen, but this is something quite interesting that's only happened recently. On the 1st of July this year, AMSA introduced Marine Order 503, which is a risk-based survey regime. So if you're not familiar with DCVs, there's 4 classes of survey. You've got Class 1, which is your passenger ferries. Class 2 is work boats and charter boats operating with up to 12 passengers. Class 3 is your fishing fleets. And Class 4 is your hire and dry fleets. They've then broken them down to high, medium and low risk categories. You'll see your passenger ferries are up at high risk. And then you work your way down into the smaller charter type boats. Fishing boats are medium and low, and then your hire and dry fleets. And then, basically under that, remembering originally we used to see every boat every year. Now, those high risk vessels we'll see 4 times in 5 years, because there's a renewal every 5 years of the certificate. The medium risk vessels we'll see twice in 5 years, and the low risk vessels we'll see once every 5 years. And then we've also got what's called an Exemption 2 for vessels operating in bays like Port Phillip and Western Port that are less than 12 metres. They can apply for an Exemption 2, which means they need to comply with a recreational type standard during construction, but after that, never to be seen again by a surveyor. But there will be potentially audits of those vessels. So no one from AMSA's in the room here. This is something we really disagree with. We find that our high-risk vessels, our ferry operators and our big Class 2 vessel operators, very professional companies, safety management systems, qualified crews, we don't see a lot of, generally, non-compliance in those vessels. When we're in the government, we'd see non-compliance with most of these because quite often they're your civil contractors doing bridge works and that type of work. They're not marine people. They're mum and dads that are getting into fishing. They might start a fishing business or a little charter business and potentially never own vessels in their lives. And then the boats you hire to people out there, the public, who potentially need a marine licence to operate them. They were the ones every time we went along each year, we'd have a long list of deficiencies. Now some of those boats, are seen once in 5 years. So I think in the coming 5 to 10 years, we will potentially see issues in these vessels and non-compliance. It just means that AMSA are actually going to have to get out there and make sure they're auditing them to make sure they're compliant and continuing the training and education of these operators to make sure that they're taking ownership of it.
Does the feedback on the risks so far marry with the table?
It's only been going, we're up going 5 months now, so...
But over the last 5 years, you're saying you saw defects?
The data haven't really been collected, but I do know from working in Victoria, we didn't really collect that data, but talking to other surveyors, you'd always find that they were the vessels, and just because their primary business, if they're a small family company, they want to go fishing, they want to go fish. They've got a boat there, as long as it floats, they can go and fish. So that's their primary goal. Whereas you look at a big company like the Queenscliff Sorrento Ferries, they've got engineers and skippers and management all to look after all that type of thing. So, and they need to maintain the reliance of the vessel, otherwise they lose an income. So, but yeah, it'll be interesting. AMSA have introduced a system called Mars, which we do all our uploads to. And you're supposed to actually list all your deficiencies when you do that. The problem is you'll go and write a deficiency list and if there's 25 deficiencies there, they're asking you to re-enter all those deficiencies into their system when you get back as a surveyor. I admit I don't do that. I sort of upload the deficiency list to them and let them do that. So whether they're doing that to actually capture that information is interesting. But they do have the ability to, through their audits, if they find them non-compliant, to bump them up to medium risk. I don't know if that's happened yet, but we will see. Now, I thought I would touch on naval architects and marine surveys since we're a arena meeting tonight. There are plenty of naval architects working as marine surveyors around Australia and around the world. It's something I always, even at uni, I wanted to do. I think I've touched on plan approval. Basically, as a naval architect doing plan approval, you're being provided plans from a naval architect to verify that they comply with rules. So the adopted rule for the larger commercial vessel in Australia is the Lloyd's Special Service Craft rules. So usually you create spreadsheets around that, or you cheat like I do and go and pay Lloyd's for a software to actually do all your assessment on that. But you've also got to have a greater understanding of the fit out of vessels and bilge systems, fire systems, cooling, water, the whole gamut across a vessel. So a lot of that experience I found came from working on the job once you finish your qualifications and learning all that way. Initial survey, another key thing. As a naval architect, we understand construction and loads and the design of the vessel, so that's easily transferred over into the building environment. Obviously, you need to have a good understanding of welding for aluminium and steel vessels. Fiberglass vessels, you have to have a good understanding of your different reinforcements, your resins, how you actually lay up a boat properly. So a lot of that experience comes through practical knowledge. You'll see a lot of shipwrights that are really good initial surveyors because they've got that experience, they've built boats, they have a really good understanding. The one that's really dropping off here in Australia, I should touch on it periodically, is timber vessels. There's not a lot of surveyors around now that are accredited for timber, and obviously we're not seeing a lot of vessels built in timber, but there are still a lot of vessels continuing to operate out there that are timber. And the other thing obviously is stability booklets, stability approvals. So as an accredited surveyor for stability, you'll witness inclining experiments for naval architects. You'll review and approve stability books for them. Witness lightship experiments. And then on the smaller vessels, AMPs allow simplified stability criteria. So as accredited surveyors, we can run simplified stability tests ourselves, which is basically just moving weights on a vessel and measuring loss of freeboards and producing reports for those vessels. They're all vessels that don't require comprehensive GZ curves and that type of thing. And I thought I would touch on a new one that's just been implemented by AMPs this year with that Marine Order 503. It's the 5-year renewals and lightship checks. So previously, the 5-year checks of lightships were quite relaxed, and I believe most states and territories didn't do them. But basically, any vessel over 12 metres now needs a lightship check at its 5-year. Under 12, you can do a declaration potentially that you haven't shifted weights or moved weights. I believe AMSA brought this in because they've recognised there's a lot of operators around Australia that don't have stability booklets, especially a lot of the fishing fleets, workboat fleets. If they do have them, the operator has either lost them or never put them on board the boat. So there's potentially stability booklets sitting in marine agencies around Australia because a lot of the agencies didn't hand over a lot of the data to AMSA when they took over. For instance, Victoria, before 2013, all that data was owned by the state, so the state retains it. Anything after 2013 was handed on to AMSA. So a client I've got at the moment who wants a stability book out of TSB needs to apply for a freedom of information to actually obtain a copy of that stability book that he owned that he potentially just lost. And he could wait a month or two to get it. But we're finding, so we go along to a 23 metre, say 16 metre fishing boat, and we say we're doing a renewal survey, we've got to do a lightship, where's your stability book? Oh, sorry, I don't have the stability book. we can't go and do a light ship because we've got no baseline to compare against. So the poor old owner either goes back to the state or the original designer and tries to get a copy, or he has to go and get another stability booklet developed. And quite often they don't have a lines plan, so you've got to take the lines off the vessel, you've got to develop the stability booklet, and then you've got to have it approved by the accredited surveyor. So that can be quite a costly exercise too. So it's something that most owners have been agreeable with at the moment, but these renewal surveys are only just starting. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But I can really see why ANSA are doing it, because to have vessels, there's been a few incidents around Australia in recent times where vessels have turned over, and I haven't read the investigations reports, but if ANSA are certifying those vessels and they don't have stability booklets and incidents are happening, then potentially they're liable. So I think that's primarily why that's been introduced, and probably for the better, but yeah, it'll have big impacts on the fleet. And that's about it, pretty short, but I thought you'd want to go for beers, so I'll open it up for questions. And that's one that's just being delivered by Heart Marine here in Mornington, a police boat for Victoria. That's just a 12-metre boat that they just delivered. The first boat they've got a bit of water jets in it. They've always just done pilot boats here. Yeah, so that was delivered about a month ago. So that's your typical type DCV, and probably one of the bigger DCV boat builders in Victoria. We don't have a lot of boat building in Victoria anymore on commercial sites. A lot of smaller boat builders, but it's really dropped off the volume here in Victoria. It's more so over in the other states, South Australia, West Australia, New South Wales and Queensland. But yeah, any questions?
And thanks very much. Very interesting talk, and we should try and get you to do this at some of the other states as well. But I have the question I have is really regarding the exemptions or equivalent solutions
Yep.
that you were talking about. And I've heard a number of people say that you do a lot of work to get an equivalent solution, and then somebody else does the same work on a similar vessel to get an equivalent solution, and somebody else does the same. So there's a lot of repeated work.
Yep.
And AMSA won't share with other people your equivalent solution.
No.
Obviously, the IP belongs to you, so AMSA can't really do that. But in some cases, perhaps naval architects wouldn't mind sharing that with other naval architects. Do you have any sort of views on that?
Yeah, so they will issue what's called a generic equivalent solution. I think they've issued about 20 of them now, but they don't seem to be adopted around equivalent solutions. They're more adopting standards, say for a rigid inflatable boat that can comply to ISO 6185, where it's imported. They'll issue a generic equivalent solution outside of the standard to be able to accept those boats. And they do adopt, actually a good example is Heart Marine. On their boats, they have to put 30-minute structural fire protection all through their engine rooms and in their boats. And you find they're taking up the wall space on the deck head, the bulkheads, this thick, so your engine room's this big and all of a sudden it's this big. And they're only operating out at 30 nautical miles. When I was at TSV, we applied, it was when the transition was happening, we applied for an equivalent solution for a 2C boat and they knocked it back. Then they released the fire safety, reissued it recently, and lo and behold, the structural fire protection was moved out of the F2C vessels. So it's not, that was a bit confusing. But they are, because a lot of equivalent solutions have been adopted and they recognise that it's reasonable. They have been writing them into the standards. But you're right, there would be a lot of duplication going on.
And obviously they can't do it. They can't give you an equivalent solution just willy-nilly because it does actually belong to you. But on the other hand, it would help the industry if you gave permission and other naval architects give permission. But I don't think there's a system in AMSA for them to allow them to do that.
And it's quite costly because an operator, they won't know how to do it, so they come to us. We've obviously got to charge a fee, and then they'll submit an application to AMSA, and AMSA charge an hourly fee to assess it as well. And then potentially at the end of all that, AMSA might come back and knock it back. So it puts a lot of pressure on us because we're charging a fee to do something. We've got to be quite confident in ourselves that
wouldn't worry about that. Half the lawyers charge and they lose the case.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
I wouldn't worry about that. They charge a lot more than
James, thanks. That was great. Have you found that? I understand that AMSA was being very slow to approve things.
Yep.
I guess my concern is if we go and put a crane on a ship, on a DCV ship, which there's only one which we've ever done, but it can occur. What's the what's the typical lead time to get through AMSA's bottleneck?
So on
And is
equivalent
that getting better?
solutions,
Yeah.
sorry,
And is that getting better?
yeah, I've been told it is. Equivalent solutions used to be when they first started a couple of months. Some of the guys in AMSA tell me they turn around within 2 weeks. But they've also recognised AMSA that they actually are slow.
Yeah.
In a federal government. So they now allow on a new build like this, at the end of the new build, I can issue a letter to say, okay, we've done the final survey, we've cleared all the deficiencies. I recommend this boat's safe to go to sea, and they'll issue a permit for that boat to operate for 3 months. Because they just can't issue a survey to next week.
Yeah.
So they have given freedom to us to do that. And then on the periodic surveys as well, where the renewal survey is coming up and the certificate expires, through the 586 deficiency report, we can actually allow them to continue to operate for 90 days. So if I was doing a crane on you and you appointed me as your accredited surveyor, I could go and do the plan approval, the load testing, whatever went around it, make the recommendation to AMSA, and then apply that permit for the vessel to go and operate until they reach it.
For 3 months.
Yeah.
Cool.
How does the
I was just like, so I was saying it to you before, James, but something I also saw up in Queensland, like where there's a surveyor involved in the design and construction, there's also a perception that they may also be involved in the compliance surveys if they actually get out on water. How is that overcome legally so that you have got that third party investment?
So it's written into the national law under the conflict of interest regs. So you, as a designer, you can design a boat and you can approve your plans, but you can't witness the initial survey of that boat. So you basically can't approve the construction of the boat. The only way around that is if it's an existing vessel, and as a naval architect or an accredited surveyor, you went and drew up that existing vessel because it didn't have plans, you're not theoretically the designer. So you could actually potentially approve those plans and witness that build through, and you wouldn't be outside the national law.
Yeah, because that's what I saw up in Queensland where the designs had come from overseas and they were building that vessel and he'd signed off on those plans.
Yep.
But there was also compliance as well.
I just think as a company, I wouldn't want to be doing that. You just got to think about if you ever ended up in court and you said, oh, I did this and I did this and I did this, you'd be screwed. So as a company, we don't do it, but there are consultants out there doing it.
The discussion sort of largely around new vessels. The pathway for bringing already constructed vessels into survey was always very fraught. I form the impression even if we're talking in the lower right-hand corner of that risk matrix, it's probably tougher than ever before.
So that exemption 2 I talked about, which is vessels less than 12 metres that are operating in partially smooth waters, carrying up to 4 passengers, but mainly work boats, fishing boats. There's modifiers that don't allow it, where they're putting massive loads on deck or anything, but they just comply with a REC standard, which is the NSCV Part G. But they need level flotation, they need to comply with maximum load capacities, powering. But it's quite easy to actually comply with that. And then they send a declaration to AMSA to say that they're compliant, and AMSA can issue them a letter to say, off you go. You'll find that actually to verify that compliance is quite difficult, so most of the operators still come to consultants like us and saying, can you do these calculations for us to verify that?
I imagine including sail in that would add another level. In some ways your power is coming down, but there's a whole lot of other forces that have to be mathed in, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. Sorry, I sort of missed the start of that.
So just sailing vessels. You know,
Oh, sorry, sail.
Yeah.
Yeah, we no, sailing vessels come under NS.
Yeah, they do.
There are some sail training schools and that sort of thing.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, sail training schools are adopted under there. Yeah, and so the construction of the vessel actually isn't even verified of those type of vessels. They basically have level or basic flotation, so they can set up well, the hull can fall apart. Hopefully the boat still floats and no one dies. So that's where that standard is pretty easy. To bring an existing vessel in that's never been in survey that's outside of that exemption 2 category is as tricky as it's ever been, and more so in some ways. This Marine Order 503 that they introduced basically has all these triggers that trigger it to be a transitional vessel, and then even if it's an existing vessel that old standards apply to, if there's a trigger there, then potentially new standards then apply to that vessel. Fiberglass, people that come to us with fiberglass vessels that have never been in survey, I almost tell them to go away. Well, I don't, but if it hasn't been surveyed during construction, it's likely that the construction, if it was built to rec standard, isn't going to apply. Anyway, you also need to take cutouts of the hull and get them all tested still, because you don't know what the resin ratios are or the fibre or anything. So that's all. It's all, yeah. Aluminium is still not so bad because you can easily get on meter scaling. And the other key thing that's a real issue is a boat falls out of survey for more than 2 years now, start again. So treat it like a new vessel, which is a big one. Because you don't want a vessel that's 20 years old that's to comply with new standards. Probably just not going to comply.
Do you know if Gareth and the like, or is anyone pushing back on AMSA trying to fix these risk issues and the like?
We did for a long time. When we were part of the state, so they always consulted with the states.
Yeah.
And surveyors I know in Victoria pushed back a lot. We wrote a lot of papers and documents disagreeing with it. They provided fairly meat feedback, I must admit. But the agenda always seemed, they say improvement in safety, but they seem to always try to appease the operators and keep the costs down. Because it's
going to end in death. So.
Yeah. I mean, I've always said, what's the difference between a vessel with 4 people on it to one with 250? A death's a death.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what type.
Do you think there's a role for the institution to liaise with AMSA to try and bring?
We have in the past.
We're trying to at the moment,
Yeah.
but what's difficult is getting people to give the sort of feedback you're giving, so that we can take that to AMSA. I mean, I can't say the sort of things you're saying.
Yeah.
I can speak to AMSA, but I can't. We've got to get enough members of the institution who are able to share their latest issues, because, as you said at the beginning, issues are changing all the time, in a paper that is not attacking AMSA, but is in a collaborative sort of sense.
Yeah.
We're trying to do that as an institution, but we haven't had any success yet. So perhaps we should talk about
Yeah, maybe talk about getting a representative from each state or something, and
because that'll look pretty bad on us as a community.
Well, as a profession.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the problem is now, when we were in government, we had a lot of time to do all that. Now we're in the real world, we've got to make money.
Yeah.
We're just out there trying to make money, so we don't have a lot of time.
But I think also as an individual company trying to make money, AMSA will take a particular view of you. But as the Institution of Naval Architects, which is not favouring any one company, but just taking a general view, AMSA might be. But we've got to have the information to.
Yeah, I'm happy to work. Yeah, definitely. Whether we get a lot of individuals together and we.
Oh, we do it. Yeah.
There was talk about that a few years ago.
We're trying to do it. We have actually a liaison committee,
right?
But it hasn't been as useful as it could have been. Mainly because people like you have not been giving us the information because everybody's really busy. So we've got to find a way past that, and then if we can get that information and collate it as an institution, and liaise with AMSA. And AMSA, I think, would accept it.
Yeah, I think it'll work its way out. I mean, if the incidents start to increase, AMSA will have to take notice of them, and they do. I've got to touch on them. A lot of their surveyors and naval architects they've employed now, you hear from operators, they are actually out there auditing them. So they're actually, I don't know if they're on the water, but they're grabbing them at the dock and everything and going over the boats. Some of the issues they are having is they're using their port state control surveyors who are used to big ships to go on small vessels and they don't understand the NSCV and they don't understand small vessels because a fishing boat, you can't expect it to be at the same level of compliance that an international trading ship is. So we are hearing some feedback on that, but at least they're out there actually trying to verify the compliance of some of these operators. And they've got those safety duties under that national law. There's quite large penalties on naval architects, builders, operators under that, so they can enforce penalties. They've got plenty of lawyers in Canberra, so there could be penalties involved. But their mantra is they want industry to start taking ownership of their safety. Instead of the surveyor going along every year and telling them to do this, they want them to take that ownership, and understandable, but I guess it's the education of them too. We've definitely given AMSA feedback.
Yeah.
But their argument for the whole system would be that Victoria came from a situation where every vessel was inspected every year, whereas we bring up an issue like what you've just spoken about, like you'll have a 12-metre vessel that's self-declared and operating as a commercial vessel out here with 4 people. They'll turn that around and say, well, in Queensland they've got a whole series of boats that were built to under 10 metres that didn't need to be a commercial vessel. So you have this situation where you have this 9.9 metre trawler, quite a big trawler at 9.9 metres, and with about 20 little dories, little tenders that run off them with the Indigenous guys that don't speak English, and they all go out for like a few days fishing, and hopefully they will come back with some fish. And so, you know, we speak about our issues here about, you know, a guy doesn't want to have a life ring on board, and so we put an equivalent solution. Yeah, they've got just bigger fish to fry. So their holistic view, which I can understand, but we certainly bring up those issues around the risk-based survey, especially around, because not only do AMSA set the regulation, by virtue they set the maintenance standard. So all these companies now come back to us and say, what do you mean we only have to pull a boat out of the water once every 5 years? Some big companies too doing that. And I guess they're going to do that at their own peril, and they just say to us, well, you want us to take it out twice in a 5-year period because you're going to make more money. It actually hasn't been the case, because if they only take it out once every 5 years, they end up taking it out for about 5 times as long. So I think it'll work itself out eventually, or just people die. One of the two things will happen.
Yeah, but I suppose what I say, as a profession, I think we should help AMSA work it out if we can do so quicker. And
I just don't think that was it.
there's some things that that the institution can perhaps do that individual organisations can't do quite so well, because you maybe seem to be pushing your own barrel. But on the other hand, if you can collaborate with other naval architects in the institution, we can put a joint thing together, then perhaps it will not be seen to be any one person pushing their own barrel. Where it's appropriate. Anyway, we can maybe talk about that with Rabir later on.
Yep.
Yes, on that, I'll just everyone put their hands together again for everyone once again enjoyed some really good debates.
Oh, I thought it was
fantastic. So,
I guess I'm so used to it.
You're more questions than most.
really good, mate. I much appreciate
Alright.
it. So, I forgot to mention, if anyone does need a continuing professional development certificate for tonight, then please email Owen, the secretary, and he can prepare that for you. Otherwise, please join us over at the what's it called? The Boat Builders Yard across the way for a
You're
drink.
going to show us the way.
Yeah, we'll show you across the bridge. Yes.
It's that way.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
What's that?
It's that way.
That way, yeah.